Racist cop assaults. Innocent black veteran unaware. He's the police commissioner's father. It was a quiet afternoon in downtown Chicago when the unsettling sound of shouting broke the usual hum of the bustling city. A black man in his late 60s, dressed in a modest jacket adorned with a small military insignia, stood outside a café waiting for a friend. His name was James Carter, a retired Army veteran with a calm demeanor and a kind smile that masked years of service and sacrifice. As James sipped his coffee, a police officer named Officer Bradley walked by, his eyes narrowing. Bradley was known in the precinct for his quick temper and unchecked bias. Spotting James, Bradley's demeanor shifted. Without cause, he approached the elderly veteran, his voice sharp. "Hey, you can't loiter here," Bradley barked. James calmly replied, "I'm not loitering, officer. I'm waiting for someone." But Bradley wasn't interested in listening. "Don't get smart with me," he sneered, stepping closer. Before James could explain further, Bradley grabbed his arm and pushed him against the wall, accusing him of trespassing. Passers-by gasped, some pulling out their phones to record the incident. "You don't understand," James began, but Bradley cut him off, escalating the situation. What Bradley didn't know was that James Carter wasn't just anyone. He was the father of Chicago's newly appointed police commissioner, a man who would ensure this moment became a lesson Officer Bradley would never forget. James Carter wasn't just any retired veteran. He was a decorated war hero who had dedicated over 30 years of his life to serving his country. After retiring from the Army, he chose to live a quiet life in Chicago, spending his days mentoring young veterans and volunteering at the local community center. Despite his humility, James carried himself with a quiet pride that came from years of discipline and sacrifice. That afternoon, James was at his favorite café, a spot he often visited with his son, Elijah Carter, who happened to be the newly appointed police commissioner of Chicago. Elijah had grown up idolizing his father, learning values like integrity, respect, and service to others. James had always taught him that power should be used to uplift, not oppress. Officer Bradley, on the other hand, had a vastly different outlook. Known among his peers for his aggressive tactics and discriminatory behavior, he often targeted those he thought wouldn't fight back. For him, James Carter was just another target. As Bradley shoved James against the wall, James maintained his composure. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong," he said, his voice steady. But Bradley wasn't listening. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snapped, tightening his grip on James's arm. The crowd of onlookers began to grow, their murmurs turning into protests. A young woman stepped forward, her phone recording the entire encounter. "Let him go!" she shouted. "He hasn't done anything." Bradley turned his glare toward the woman. "Stay back. This doesn't concern you," he barked. James, aware of the tension building around them, tried once more to reason with Bradley. "Son, I've seen men like you before. You think strength is about power, but real strength is about control." Bradley smirked. "Save the lecture, old man." As the situation escalated, one of the bystanders dialed 911, requesting the presence of another officer. "This is out of hand," the caller said. "The guy hasn't done anything wrong and the cop is roughing him up." At that moment, Commissioner Elijah Carter was in a meeting at police headquarters when his assistant rushed in. "Sir, you need to see this," she said, holding up her phone. A live stream of the incident was circulating online, and Elijah froze when he recognized his father. Within minutes, Elijah was in his car, sirens blaring, heading straight for the café. Anger and disbelief coursed through him as he replayed the video in his mind. His father, the man who had taught him everything about justice and fairness, was being treated like a criminal by one of his own officers. As Elijah neared the scene, he knew this wasn't just about defending his father. This was about sending a message that no one, not even a cop, was above accountability. As Commissioner Elijah Carter sped toward the café, his mind raced. This was more than just an assault on his father. It was an assault on the very principles he had sworn to uphold. His father's teachings had shaped his career, emphasizing fairness, respect, and the duty to protect, not to harm. Yet here was one of his own officers embodying everything Elijah had vowed to root out. When Elijah arrived at the café, the scene was chaotic. A crowd had gathered, some shouting at Officer Bradley to release James, while others continued recording on their phones. James remained calm, though his hands were now cuffed behind his back. His eyes met Elijah's as his son emerged from the police car, the look of disappointment in his father's gaze cutting deeper than any words could. "Commissioner Carter?" someone in the crowd exclaimed, recognizing Elijah. The murmurs grew louder as people realized who he was. Bradley turned, his expression shifting from smug confidence to confusion, and then panic. "Sir?" he stammered, unsure how to react. "Release him," Elijah said coldly, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Bradley hesitated. "But sir, he was—" "Release him now," Elijah repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Bradley fumbled with the keys, unlocking the cuffs and stepping back. James rubbed his wrists, his expression unreadable as he stood beside his son. The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, but Elijah wasn't done. He turned to Bradley, his eyes blazing. "What's your badge number?" Bradley stiffened. "Commissioner, I—" "Badge number." "Now," Elijah demanded. Bradley mumbled the number, his bravado completely gone. Elijah gestured to another officer who had arrived on the scene. "Escort Officer Bradley back to headquarters. I'll deal with him personally." Once Bradley was gone, Elijah turned to address the crowd. "I want to thank all of you for standing up and documenting what happened here today," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Accountability starts with speaking out, and I promise you this matter will be handled swiftly and fairly." The crowd slowly began to disperse, but many lingered, eager to see how the story would unfold. Elijah placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Are you okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice softening. James nodded. "I'm fine, son. It's you I'm worried about." Elijah frowned. "Me?" James gave him a knowing look. "This isn't just about me, Elijah. This is about the system you're trying to fix. Today was a small battle, but the war is far from over." Back at police headquarters, Elijah wasted no time. He called an emergency meeting with his top officers, playing the video of the incident in full view of everyone present. The room was silent as the footage ended, the weight of what they had seen settling heavily over the group. "This is unacceptable," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "We're supposed to serve and protect, not target and harass. Officer Bradley's actions are not an isolated incident. They're a symptom of a deeper problem." One of his deputies, Captain Ruiz, spoke up. "Commissioner, what's your plan for addressing this?" Elijah leaned forward, his expression resolute. "First, Bradley will face disciplinary action, including suspension without pay, while we conduct a full investigation. Second, we're implementing mandatory training on bias, de-escalation, and community engagement for every officer on the force. Third, I want an open forum with community leaders to rebuild trust. We're not just fixing this incident, we're fixing the culture that allowed it to happen." Word of the incident and Elijah's swift response spread quickly. Local news outlets picked up the story, airing the footage of Bradley's assault on James and highlighting Elijah's commitment to accountability. The public's reaction was mixed. Many praised Elijah for taking a stand, but others questioned whether his personal connection to the case would cloud his judgment. James, ever the steady presence, encouraged his son to stay the course. "You can't let public opinion distract you," he said over dinner that evening. "This is about doing what's right, not what's popular." Elijah nodded. "You're right, Dad, but it's hard not to feel the weight of it all." James smiled. "You've carried heavier loads, son. Trust yourself." Meanwhile, Bradley was far from remorseful. He sought out a lawyer and began framing himself as the victim of an overzealous commissioner. "It was a misunderstanding," he told reporters in a carefully crafted statement. "I was just doing my job, and now I'm being punished because of who he is." Elijah refused to let the noise deter him. He held a press conference to address the situation directly. Standing at the podium with James by his side, Elijah began, "This is not about my father. This is about the principles of justice and equality that every officer should uphold. No one is above the law, not even those who enforce it." James spoke next, his voice filled with quiet authority. "I've fought for this country, and I've fought for the ideals it represents. What happened to me isn't just my story. It's a story shared by many who feel unseen and unheard. Today, I stand with my son, not just as his father, but as a citizen who believes in change." The press conference was a turning point. Public support for Elijah's reforms grew, and the incident became a rallying cry for systemic change within the police department. As the days turned into weeks, Elijah's policies began to take effect. Officers attended workshops and community forums, learning from the very people they were sworn to protect. James became a regular speaker at these events, sharing his experiences and helping bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Even Bradley's staunchest defenders couldn't ignore the overwhelming evidence against him. After a thorough investigation, he was terminated from the force, his actions serving as a warning to others that prejudice and abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. As the reforms Elijah implemented began to take root, the atmosphere within the police department started to shift. Officers who had once dismissed discussions of bias and accountability now found themselves engaging in meaningful conversations with community members. Trust, though still fragile, began to grow between the department and the public. However, the journey was far from over. One afternoon, Elijah received a call from Captain Ruiz. "Commissioner, we've uncovered something during the investigation into Officer Bradley," Ruiz said. "You need to see this." Elijah drove to headquarters immediately, his mind racing. When he arrived, Ruiz handed him a file. Inside were records of numerous complaints filed against Bradley over the years, complaints that had been quietly dismissed or ignored by previous leadership. Worse, the documents revealed that Bradley had been shielded by a network of senior officers who shared his discriminatory mindset. "This goes deeper than we thought," Ruiz said grimly. Elijah's hands tightened around the file. "We're not just dealing with one bad officer," he said. "We're dealing with a culture that's been allowed to fester." Determined to root out the corruption, Elijah called for an internal audit of the entire department. He enlisted the help of independent investigators to ensure transparency, a move that was met with resistance from some of the old guard. Anonymous letters began circulating among the ranks, accusing Elijah of going too far and creating division within the force. But Elijah stood firm. "Division already exists," he said at a department meeting. "What we're doing is shining a light on it so we can heal." Meanwhile, James continued to play an active role in the reforms, speaking at public forums and supporting his son's efforts. His presence reminded everyone of the stakes, not just for the victims of discrimination, but for the integrity of the police force itself. At one forum, James addressed a room full of officers. "Change isn't easy," he said, his voice steady. "I know what it's like to be part of an institution where you're expected to follow orders, even when they don't feel right. But real strength comes from standing up and saying, 'This isn't who we are.' You have a chance to be better, not just for yourselves, but for the people who look to you for protection." As the investigation continued, Elijah uncovered more troubling truths. A small group of officers had been using their positions to target vulnerable individuals, fabricating charges and abusing their authority. Among them was a senior lieutenant who had mentored Bradley and encouraged his behavior. Elijah acted swiftly, holding a press conference to announce the findings. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident," he said. "It's about dismantling a system that allows prejudice to thrive. To the people of Chicago, we hear you, we see you, and we are committed to change." The community's response was overwhelmingly supportive, but the backlash from within the department grew louder. Elijah began receiving threats, anonymous letters warning him to back off, to stop destroying the force. One night, his car tires were slashed, and graffiti was spray-painted outside his home. The message was clear. There were those who wanted him gone. James, ever the steady presence, reminded his son why he couldn't back down. "You've come too far to stop now," he said. "The people who are fighting you are afraid of losing their power. That means you're doing something right." The climactic moment came when Elijah called a mandatory meeting for the entire department. Standing before hundreds of officers, he laid everything on the table: the findings of the investigation, the steps being taken to rebuild trust, and the consequences for those who refused to adapt. "This department can either evolve or crumble under the weight of its own corruption," Elijah said, his voice echoing through the room. "The choice is yours. But let me be clear. If you're not here to serve with honor, integrity, and respect for all, you have no place in this uniform." The room was silent as Elijah finished speaking. Then, one by one, officers began to stand and applaud. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough to signal that the tide was truly turning. The ripple effect of Elijah's speech at the department meeting was immediate and profound. Officers who had once been silent about injustices began to speak out, supporting the reforms and holding their colleagues accountable. The toxic elements within the department were slowly being weeded out, and a sense of purpose started to return to the ranks. Elijah continued his mission, but the scars from the journey were undeniable. Threats against him persisted, and the pressure of leading such a monumental change weighed heavily. Yet, every time doubt crept in, his father was there to remind him why the fight mattered. James, despite his calm demeanor, had his own battles to face. The memory of Bradley's assault lingered, and the humiliation he had endured was not easily forgotten. But James chose to channel his pain into purpose. He joined a local advocacy group for veterans, using his platform to highlight issues of racial bias and inequality. One afternoon, James stood before a crowd of veterans, sharing his story. "We've fought battles abroad," he said, his voice steady. "But sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we face at home. It's not enough to demand respect. We have to teach it, live it, and ensure it's passed down to the next generation." The incident at the café became a pivotal moment in Chicago's history. Community leaders praised Elijah's swift actions and his willingness to confront systemic issues head-on. The reforms he implemented, mandatory training, independent oversight, and open community forums, were adopted as a model for other cities grappling with similar challenges. The department began seeing a slow but steady improvement in public trust. Neighborhoods that had once viewed officers with suspicion started engaging with them during outreach events. Elijah's efforts were paying off, and even his critics had to acknowledge the tangible progress being made. Months later, a special ceremony was held at City Hall to honor James Carter for his resilience and contributions to the community. Elijah stood proudly by his father's side as the mayor presented James with a plaque and thanked him for being a symbol of strength and dignity. In his acceptance speech, James said, "This recognition isn't just for me. It's for everyone who has ever felt unseen or unheard. It's a reminder that change is possible when we stand together and demand better." The room erupted into applause, and for a brief moment, the weight of the past felt lighter. As they left the ceremony, Elijah turned to his father. "You've always been my hero," he said quietly. James smiled. "And you've become mine," he replied, his voice filled with pride. "What would you do if you witnessed an injustice like this? Would you stand up and take action, or would you walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective.